Hello, Jonathan. Welcome to our show. How are you doing today?
I'm great. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you for being here. You're doing some very interesting stuff in our city, which is in desperate need of interesting stuff to be done. And we're going to dive deep into your project and what you guys are achieving through that project. But why don't we start by giving our audience a little bit of introduction about you and maybe tell us who you are?
Sure. So again, thanks so much for having me. My name is Jonathan Diamond. I work with my brother Gabriel Diamond. We're a third generation family real estate company. We own and operate a portfolio of multifamily apartment buildings and commercial retail centers. We've been doing that since the early 1950s. Not myself, of course. And over the years, we've been building the portfolio slowly and steady, either through acquisitions or sort of substantial renovation projects, and most recently some development projects that we're working on.
Mhm. Okay, that's good. I was doing my research, my homework before doing this, and I know you have a PhD in neuroscience. Did I get that right?
You did get that right, yeah. As my thesis supervisor said, and I'll use his line, it's getting a little rusty at this point, but yes, in 2015, I believe, yeah.
So
Yeah.
I've had the opportunity and the privilege of working with a lot of people who come from different backgrounds into construction and specifically into real estate development. And I fully encourage it and I love it because I think we need a lot of smart people to come in and try to solve the problem that we've been dealing with. But I have to admit, you're probably the farthest one that I'm talking to from the farthest discipline possible coming back to real estate development. Why are you interested in development?
Well, I mean, it took a while to get there. So when I was working on my PhD, it was with the intention of running a lab. But as you get older, your interests change. I was getting more involved in business, and my brother had already been working in the business and asked me, or I had asked him what it's like, and it turned out there was an opportunity for me there. And so over the last almost 10 years now, I've sort of evolved a niche. And as these new projects have come along, we've sort of built out a niche on the development side. And I think to your point, you said smart people. I wouldn't go that far, but I do think that the industry benefits from people with a lot of varied backgrounds. So I think one
Right.
of the characteristics of the real estate industry is that you have a lot of business people. And it is a business at the end of the day, of course. But I think that the industry would benefit from people coming from all sorts of backgrounds, especially in the engineering disciplines. I think we'll get into it a bit later, but I do believe that development is an engineering challenge above all else. And I think people with a technical background can certainly add some value to the field.
I love to think about it that way, and I have thought about it that way for a long time. But at the same time, they say the definition of insanity is doing the same thing again and again and expecting a different result. And there is where someone like you would come in. And that's actually one of the questions I want to ask you is that when you come in, because I've been in this business or in this industry my entire life, basically my earliest memories, I've been involved in one way or another through my parents. And I haven't seen anything else per se, if you may. What was your first impression? You come to the industry and say, is that how you're doing it? Like, really? You guys are doing it like that? Did you have one of those moments when you originally were introduced to the concept, especially development side?
Yeah, I mean, the development side, because for our firm, it's been really, I would say, the last 3 or so years, 3, 4 years, where we've really gotten into it. So I had a lot of exposure to the industry leading up to that point. But I think as a whole, just understanding the broader context of real estate and the advancements that it's been made, especially with respect to other industries, is really elucidating, right? So
Mm-hmm.
if you look at McKinsey's report from a few years back, you see the efficiency of every other industry, especially manufacturing and the tech sector, sort of increasing pretty substantially, especially with things like Moore's Law, for example, where processing power becomes exponentially faster and the price goes down. In contrast, we've had no such efficiencies in the construction sector, in the development
True.
sector. And that's not an observation that I've made. Many people have made this observation, but it is really telling once you're engaged in the business. And then one other really interesting thing is our company has not built a building in recent years, which means that we're really coming at this with fresh eyes, which I think was very beneficial. And some people have said, well, maybe that's risky. You might be at a disadvantage because you haven't built the volume that all of these experienced developers have around the city. But what I always say to that is fair enough. There's certain things that we've been learning and many mistakes we've made along the way, no doubt. But we have been operating these assets. And so we have a very good idea of how they operate and what we want to end up with. And so you have an extremely clear picture of what the end goal is. And then the actual development process can really be done both with just first principles thinking and sort of learning as we go along. So we didn't actually inherit a lot of bad habits, I think, that are prevalent in the industry that people take for granted.
That's actually a very interesting perspective. Okay, so let me spin that around and put it back on you. Like you said, the bulk of your experience as a family, as an organization, has been owning and running assets for long term. And coming from that perspective, give us a few pointers. Like if I'm not coming from that perspective, if I'm starting, if I've been always in construction up front, new buildings, starting from scratch, what am I missing?
Well, I mean, I'll speak broadly. So all of our assets are owned and operated long term. So we've never acquired anything or engaged in a construction project with the intent of selling it. That doesn't mean that we would never sell it. Obviously, opportunities come up and things change, but the investment thesis is always with a long-term lens. And so when we're approaching a project, it's not how can we exit? It's what is this going to look like in year 5, in year 10, in year 15, if legislation changes, for example, to reduce natural gas use, which we see happening. How do you future-proof these buildings against those changes in the energy landscape? So it's a lot of things like this that we think of. And so we're not minimizing construction costs. We're sort of minimizing operational costs on the whole. And so you see a lot of trade-offs in the design process that relate to those dynamics.
Have you come across any low-hanging fruits that you could share with our audience? Like here are 3 or 2 low-hanging fruits. If you've never owned a building and if you're trying to step into this world, these are the 2 or 3 things to watch out for?
I typically don't try to pick out sort of the 2 or 3 things. The way I typically think of this is more systemic in nature. So I can give maybe a roadmap.
Walk us through that.
Yeah, so I'll give you sort of a roadmap of how we think of this, and I'll use energy as an example, because heating bills and cooling bills are really expensive these days, and energy efficiency is a really big topic of conversation.
For sure.
So oftentimes when people think of a building's capacity to thermoregulate, we think of the efficiency of the actual heating and cooling plant. And we think of that in isolation, but really the heating and cooling plant operates within a physical structure, which has it has heat loss and it has heat gains depending on the season, especially here in Toronto, where we've got like super hot and humid summers and really cold winters. You have this massive temperature range. And the active heating and cooling plant is only but one component of the entire system. So when you talk about like insulation, when you talk about strategies for passive ventilation, these are all things that go into the whole picture. And so it's not enough to think of the efficiency of any one of those factors, but how the building operates as a whole. And the perspective that we took for the apartment project that we're working on right now, 1925 Victoria Park, it was with a holistic lens. And so what our intention was to maximize the building's performance passively. Passive requires no money and no energy injected into the system, meaning high insulation, passive ventilation for the summer. And then only once you've maximized those factors that are based on the actual design of the topology, can you move on to optimizing the active systems. And if you've done the first right, then you can have a very low, cost-effective, active heating and cooling strategy.
And that's very true. I'm fortunate enough to be able to work on a few projects where we have passive house grade envelope systems. And technically speaking, if I remember correctly, one of our engineers there was saying that basically you can warm up this building with a candle in each floor.
Yeah.
And that's how tight the envelope is and how much performance you get. But I want to circle back to something you just mentioned a few minutes ago. And that was because you were starting from scratch in the development world, you don't necessarily have some of the bad habits. Would it be right if I pinned those bad habits to trying to cut the cost cheaper and make it cheaper up front in the construction process? Is that what you meant by bad habits, or do you have other examples?
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly one of them. We've been privileged to work with an amazing group. The principals are Puya Bakhtash and Ivan Vasilev, who are now with Sirotny. They were previously at Partisans. Partisans designed the building originally. Sirotny Group is delivering it. It's a prefab building. I can get into that later. And they were really aligned in our vision and really led the way with some of these design and delivery strategies. And so we're sort of working on this together and using this 1925 Victoria project as a prototype. I mean, to specifically answer your question, what does a bad habit look like? I think just the notion that all real estate projects are over time and over budget, and the fact that we take that for granted is just kind of crazy.
Unfortunately, that's true. It is.
Right. Yeah. It would be like going to a restaurant, looking at the menu, thinking your meal is going to be $28 because that's what the price was. And then but you get it like 3 hours later and it's $48, right? Like no one would go back to that restaurant again. But a lot of these things are sort of taken for granted in the construction industry, and also just the number of consultants involved and how they all intertwine into the projects. And so it really isn't a terribly efficient process. And I'd argue that just the model of building is not ideal. And so I think one of the intentions of the industry is to create a model that is more conducive to producing buildings and delivering these structures, which is what the whole goal is for us.
Right. You hit it on the head, because I have to admit, having worked on many projects over the years, the number of consultants that we have on the projects just keeps growing. I think on one of the recent projects, we had like 26 or 28 different consulting disciplines working on a single project, which all of them brilliant people, smart decisions, and smart, but it just takes that much longer, and that adds that much more cost to the whole process, right?
Yeah, and complexity. And that's why we really argue that it's a structural shift that needs to take place. And I think also everyone needs to work together to be aligned on the same goal, which is for us, the delivery of housing. The way the system's set up right now is you have a lot of these sub goals. So you might have zoning, and you'll have SPA, and you'll have, I mean, even entire businesses just do land entitlement.
Yep.
So it shows you that just that in itself is a profitable enterprise. And the number of consultants that you need in order to entitle land is massive. And so our goal is to move as straight a line from idea to building delivery. And so if you can structure a process around that, I think you've got the right perspective. It's not so easy, but that's sort of, I think, the goal.
It's the story of the old dog and a new trick. The construction and real estate development industry as a whole is, I don't want to be negative, and because it has been changing, it has been evolving for the better for the past 10 years or so. The rate of improvement has picked up, in my opinion, but it's still not fast enough probably where we need to be. So I want to switch gears. I want to go through and talk in depth about your project. And the reason I want to talk about your project, because, and I've mentioned this to you before, is that I think it's a very ambitious project, Frank, and ambitious multiple fronts. One is, like you mentioned, this is your first development project. So having a development project of this size as a first project, and I'll let you fill in the blanks in terms of the numbers and stats when we get there, but it's an ambitious goal in and of itself. But aside from that, and correct me if I'm wrong, based on what I know from your project over there, you're trying to create a trifecta of sustainability, affordability, and repeatability, or viability, basically. That at least up until a few years ago, between sustainable, affordable, there was almost impossible mix. We're getting there now with all the incentives and everything else that's coming in. Walk us through that idea. Why pick such an ambitious goal? Why not do a smaller condo, 6 stories, straightforward? Why not start there? Why go after something so ambitious?
It's a good question. And I know that sounds insane because we're quite far in the project, but this building evolved very, I would say, gradually. I think one of the first objectives that we had above all else was to, because this is going to be in our portfolio forever, we wanted something special. We wanted something meaningful. So right away, just standard kind of cookie cutter condo developments, it was not a factor in our decision at all. If we were going to do something, we wanted to do it differently. And then special, it took us a while to find the right architecture firm to help us carry out that vision. One of the first objectives we had was to create hallways that weren't crappy. And I say that in the technical sense.
Crappy is a technical word.
And I use this in some presentation. If you look at like a double loaded corridor in the Four Seasons and a double loaded corridor in like a Holiday Inn, they're exactly the same aside from the finishes, right? There's no light. None of them is more social than the other. It's just the quality of finishes. And that to us is not interesting. And so the question was like, well, how do you actually, and even in the real estate community, we refer to that space as non-sellable square footage, meaning it doesn't have any value. So the question for us is, well, how can we make that have value? How can we transform this? And so this is what led us to these exterior single loaded corridor design. And from there, it offered performative elements such as passive cooling, so you can cross-ventilate the space, and it sort of went from there. And then over time, the ultimate objective of the city is to build more effectively mid-market housing faster. And so this first initial project we're calling phase 1 is really led into a larger strategy of like, okay, well, how do you take this model? How do you use this as a test case to bring all of these different groups together and replicate this concept, not the exact topology, but the structural system and all of this.
So you mentioned phase one, and I've heard you talk about repeatability and this being one of many. Walk us through the process, if you may. Like you just talked about this, putting together some of the players, but what are you implementing that will make the second one or the third one or the fifth one better or easier or more viable?
Sarotny Group has, I would say, revolutionized the use of a very special prefabricated system called Cree Buildings. They're a company out of Austria that produces a concrete timber hybrid slab panel. And although it's an Austrian company, you produce these locally. And so Sarotny Group has sort of built out, or in the process of building out the infrastructure to produce these panels. Same with wall elements, which is more complicated. So these are the actual elements that will be integrated into our Victoria Park project. So when we refer to repeatability and building out a model, it involves how are these slab elements and these prefabricated elements productized and digitized to afford the design process, to facilitate the design process, like in the digital realm, and how can you build that infrastructure so that you can produce subsequent projects faster and more accurately, and then hopefully in parallel, which is our goal.
So basically, your process, I guess, repeatability process, it revolves around having picked the right team. You're investing in a prototype of a system, basically, if I get it right. And hopefully there will be lessons learned incorporated to the next one, which will make it faster and go on scale. Did I get it right?
Yeah, correct.
Okay, and I heard that you're probably, I don't know if you're the first, but you're probably one of the first projects that you're thinking of using or planning on using in-floor heating and cooling, radiant. Maybe walk us through that logic.
So the in-ceiling radiant heating and cooling. So this would be heating and cooling tubes that are incorporated into the prefabricated concrete slab, which will form the ceiling. And effectively what you're doing is you're running water, either hot water, through that piping to increase the slab temperature in the winter and cool water in the summer to decrease that slab temperature. And so heating and cooling up this slab panel has a direct correlation to thermal comfort, which is a more all-encompassing measure. It's like a stand-in for temperature. And maybe I'll just dwell on there because I don't think that was clear. So typically we modify buildings with temperature, meaning air temperature, but air temperature is actually only one of the perceptual inputs to how we feel. And how we feel in a space is actually what you want to modify. And everyone sort of knows this intuitively. This is why the weather report reports the wind chill or the humidex, because we know what that means. We said, okay, well, it's 25 degrees, but it's super humid, so it feels way hotter, or it's 0 degrees and it's really windy, so it feels more cooler. And so the feels more cooler is actually what you care about in this case. And so when you're designing a building, you don't want to simply modify the temperature of the air. You want to modify the temperature of all of these other inputs, like airflow. Air temperature is obviously an input, and surface temperature, which is why bathrooms with heated floors feel so cozy inside.
Right. And I guess for the context, and I'm going out on a limb here, I'm assuming one of the reasons that you feel confident that this technology with this setup will enable you to achieve the level of comfort you're aiming for is because you probably have a very high-performing envelope system.
Yeah, correct.
In my experience, unless your envelope is really good and really tight, the in-floor heating and cooling can be not sufficient enough, I guess, in peak days. And you might have to introduce auxiliary heat and cool, which obviously in this case you're not doing, correct?
It's how everything comes together. So yeah, it's a challenge, especially because the humidity, because when you have a cold surface in a humid environment, it produces condensation. And so engineering a space to avoid that is obviously critical.
That's interesting. I want to go back to where we started, that you've been a landlord way more than you've been a developer.
Yeah.
From a landlord's perspective, and I'm probably totally off base here, but I had a feeling that the in-floor heating or cooling poses a higher risk of long-term maintenance from a landlord's perspective. Where was I wrong?
I'll just correct. So it's in ceiling. So it's the ceiling slabs that are being modified.
So it is accessible. Sorry.
Correct. It is accessible. And although it's built into the concrete, I mean, the tubing is really low maintenance because it's literally just a tube. All the mechanicals sit outside of that. And it's also, I think, like 2 millimeters or something below the surface. So if the time comes to actually have to access it, you can. But the part that's in the slab is a very simple structure
Once
tube.
it's there, it's protected. Nothing should happen to it.
Right, exactly. I mean, HVAC repairs are incredibly costly
True.
too, right? So it sort of depends what your baseline is.
True. I want to go back to the ambitious question. First of all, I'm very happy that you're doing an ambitious project because that opens doors for a whole bunch of other people to try new things and to try a new system. And you're paving the way of this new product or new concept being tried out in our city, which is very exciting and very important. That being said, I want to go back to the ambitious question, and that is, it's going to be really hard to make numbers work on a project like this because even like rental projects, given the land value in City of Toronto and GTA for the last number of years, have been very hard to work with. And I'm sure if you can share with us the structure of how a rental building is different from a condo building when you go to the financing side of it. But I'm curious to know how you're working this equation out because you're doing something that, like you said, a typical condo builder's product spec will be probably, I don't want to say lower, but cheaper in design. You're going to have, and the use of the actual square footage on each floor is probably more efficient. I haven't seen your drawings or anything, but I'm just guessing based on a single loaded corridor layout that is probably not pushed as far as a condo developer would do that. Like maybe walk us through those equations. What were you thinking? How did you manage to make it happen?
Yeah, there's a few questions there. So I'll just speak to the how do we make this work question. That's the biggest challenge, I think, building rental, especially for the mid-market. Then maybe I'll just explain why that is the case for the listeners, because I think it's a really interesting contrast that people don't typically understand. So for us, we own the land and we've owned it since the 1960s, so it's free and clear. So that's a huge benefit. So land is free in a cash sense, but obviously it has value on a pro forma. And then we've had some funding that we've achieved through CMHC, through one of their innovation funds. So those two components are helpful. And then the other thing is we have a very long-term outlook. And so if we were to have investors in this who wanted to sell the building, we'd be hard-pressed to find them. But when it's our group that's funding this ourselves, that has a long-term outlook, that comes with the land, that's using this as a prototype for future projects, the whole picture makes a lot more sense.
Mm-hmm. So it's a combination of cheap land, government incentive, and a very long-term view.
Yes, exactly. And let's not forget that during this design process, we removed HST and GST. So that this project would have been an absolute no-go. I mean, that was like $8 million on this project, right, probably. So right. It's big bucks, and because you can't finance that, the $8 million out of pocket. So it was a very good legislation.
That has been one of the biggest wins we've had recently. That alongside the reduction that happened in the parking requirements in the City of Toronto, those are the two big wins that we've had over the past few years. But I want to take that back, and I'm just trying to think, because we're also talking about something that's repeatable. So perhaps, and correct me if I'm wrong, perhaps this model of development that you're looking at could be a case study or a best practice of a project type for landowners who currently have massive pieces of land in areas that could go for a mid-market and with this system. Did I get that right?
Sorry, can you repeat that?
Okay, so I'll ask the question again.
Yeah.
Because you had free and clear piece of land, basically not everyone has that option, right?
Correct.
So your future projects or the projects that will want to use you as a case study, here's an example of this type of project we want to do. This type of project that you're defining and working on, it would be very conducive to people, other maybe institutional landowners or large scale family offices maybe?
Yeah, okay, I see. So like we want to take on that burden. That's something that we're trying to work on internally and figuring out what that model actually looks like to be viable at that mid-market. But that said, I think there's a lot of institutional players that are likely looking at similar things just because the mid-market is currently uncaptured because of this high barrier to entry. These projects are traditionally not economically viable. And so the question is, well, can you change that? That's what we're focusing on.
Gotcha. Yeah, because that's to your point. If you have to go out and purchase the land right off the bat with your own cash, then that's a very high obstacle to cross at the very beginning. I want to switch gears and talk a little bit about your experience during this whole thing. Obviously, we talked about your different background, bad habits, and a whole bunch of stuff. First of all, let me ask you, how far from actual construction are you right now?
So we have zoning. It's a zone project. So we have a few phases to go. We're hopefully going to be building Q2, Q3 of 2025.
Okay.
Yeah, so that's the goal.
It's been a long process, right? So when did you first start?
We first started considering an apartment building in the summer of 2021. So it hasn't been that long. It hasn't been that bad in the scheme of things. We also paused it internally for a little bit, trying to work out our capital stack and some of the technical aspects of this project, certain design decisions as well. So it hasn't been too bad.
If you were going to go back to when the first the discussion happened, okay, this is what we want to do, here's the idea, would you have changed anything?
We would have changed the process for sure, because we're
Okay.
sort of building that live, I would say.
Do you mind sharing it?
Yeah, I'll give you a few tidbits. I think there's a lot of trades and consultants that we brought in earlier than we needed to. There's a big emphasis to bring in different groups as early as possible in the planning stages. But I think that's not necessarily true, because there's a lot of decisions that you want to make with a small group in order to push the design along as much as possible before you bring in some of these other groups. Otherwise, there's too many cooks in the kitchen, so to speak. So I think that would be one of the things. Yeah, I mean, we've been, I would say, fairly flexible, just understanding that this is a prototype and we do know that this is very ambitious. So we're a very, it might not seem like it from what we're trying to do, but we're a very conservative group. So we've been doing this, I would say, extremely methodically. And there's been some points in time where we've got to the point where we had to make a decision. Do we keep going or do we kill it? And those were actually really hard conversations to have, and really understanding what the risks are and what the risks are if you were to keep pushing this forward. So I think fortunately, in retrospect, it worked out very well, especially with some of these legislation changes and interest rates. These are big factors that, of course, the developer has no control over, but they do help at the end of the day.
You mentioned critical decisions, and in all of my conversations with previous guests and also offline with the developers, I think if not the biggest part of a developer's role is probably maybe one of the 2 functions or 3 functions of a developer's role is to make those big picture decisions. Do you have a framework or mental model or neuroscientific background help to make those decisions? Maybe that you can give us some tips?
The only thing I think, to bring it back to neuroscience, I guess, for a second, was like I came from a really great lab at Queen's University, and it was a really small kind of competitive department. So we were really used to beating each other up intellectually and really debating ideas and really separating ideas from person. And so it made you really good at separating that and actually having really good debates about the decisions. Like that case was the science, not me as a person, and you'd all go for beers at the end. I think that sort of mindset we've percolated through to the business as well. But I've also been absolutely blessed to work with my brother, my father, and my aunt, and we're all very different personalities. My brother's a brilliant business guy. He's started businesses since like grade 10 and been running them since then. And so he had a very traditional business background and a very good entrepreneurial background. My father's been in the business forever. My aunt's been in the business for not quite as long as him, but quite a while. And I think we all have very different personalities. So when we sit around the boardroom table making decisions, we all, I think, add something unique, and we can all debate it. We typically play our respective roles very well. Some of us are more aggressive on the ideas front, and others are like, let's dial it back. Others are really good at mediating. And so I think as a team, we've been really fortunate to work through some of these decisions very productively and intelligently and unemotionally, even though it does get very tense at times. So I think that culture of openness and debate is super critical.
And separating the idea from the person, which in a family context has to be more complicated, I think.
Yeah, that definitely adds another layer for sure. Because when we were 10 years old and you don't want any of that stuff bleeding in, and it doesn't. But yeah, for whatever reason, we've been really good at keeping the conversation at the right layer.
The right frequency, yes.
The right frequency, the right layer. And it's even really tough to see decisions like no hard feelings at the end, even though if it feels like I was totally shut down, we didn't go my direction. I know that the business is probably better for it on the whole with respect to that decision, or just the broader context of how we filter input.
So that's very important. I want to go back to the technical side for a second. Obviously, you mentioned with the Cree system and your project, you're trying to push the boundaries and try new things on the technology and the system for building a better building. aside from what you're currently using, do you see any other trends or any other technologies that pique your interest and you might be, you know what, next project, we're going to do that one?
I'll tell you something recently. So I was just at CMHC for a meeting. They had like 30 of us. This was part of an innovative housing sort of consortium or workshop. And there's a few roboticists there.
Mm-hmm.
And I did a complete 180 on robotics, like in a very short period of time. And I'll preface this with saying I love technology and I love innovation, but I was very skeptical of the world of robotics in the building industry,
Right.
simply because I was thinking about it wrong. The issue that I had was that it didn't, to me, make sense to develop a system that actually required robotics, because you have two things there. You've got the actual system, which you have to invent, and then you have the actual robotics that you have to invent to build the system. And that just seemed like a huge undertaking, which required a massive investment, which I wasn't sure if it fit to where things are today. But the 180 I did was, as we're working with this prefabricated system and trying to build out some of the fabrication techniques, if you get to the point where that's a process, you can automate it, right? So once you have a physical process, there is no reason why you can't automate it. And so I think it's just the question of what is the right level of intervention, right? And especially if you use the model for like an assembly line in cars, obviously that's largely robotics, if not entirely these days. So too, can you have a similar situation with these prefab systems where you don't have robots that are building buildings, although there are some amazing companies working on that, but you can integrate robotics in order to automate a previously manual task. And I think in the context that we operate, that does have potential in the future. Not today and not project number 2, but at some point.
I totally agree with you. And I've had the opportunity and privilege of working with Intelligence City, a company out of Vancouver, for the past 18 months or so, and I've witnessed their process very closely. And exactly what you just described, because I was suspicious of how can like a robot really be working in construction. It doesn't really make sense until you see how one single armed robot can lift something which would have taken 3 guys probably 15 minutes to move, and they're just moving a piece of CLT panel, putting it up. And like, to your point, I think in their case, they've used like 2-3 years to program that arm to work. And it's been a massive amount of brain power behind it. Kudos to those guys who made it happen. But 100% agree. I think there's definitely a place for it. And from a perspective of someone who actually builds these things on a daily basis in a construction site, the precision that concept could potentially bring to our job site is very exciting. If you can have a piece that comes in within 1/8 of an inch of margin of error and fits nicely to the next one, and you don't have to worry about caulking it, or it has a joint, or it's a gasket that fits in, solves a ton of problems on the job site and for future.
Yeah, if it's implemented properly and if the process is set, it can be automated. And I think that's the key.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's definitely, we're on the same page. I want to start wrapping up our conversation here. It's been very interesting. What do you typically read to keep yourself up to date with the industry trends or technologies or other projects?
Didn't realize you were going to say real estate related, but
or if it could be non-real estate trend related.
Yeah.
Just don't say the Journal of Neuroscience, because
no, the Journal of Neuroscience. I'm not sure if you just said that. That is the name of the main neuroscience journal.
Okay.
But yeah, I mean, a lot of the publications, Urbanation comes up with a bunch of stuff, like RenSync, they come up with a bunch of studies. McKinsey comes out with stuff like on the global scale. RenX comes up with, they publish a lot of articles, Urban Toronto, like all of the standard players. And then the other thing is just constantly speaking to people, especially the brokers, because the brokers know everything. So speaking to my developer friends and my broker friends and the finance guys too, they have a really interesting vantage point to see what's getting funded, what isn't, what people are doing. So it's sort of a combination of reading, I would say, the pretty standard Toronto and Canadian real estate publications, together with just being interactive with the community, conferences as well.
True, there's a lot going on, and a lot of it happens so quickly that it's even like you need to know it in person and in context, just be attending events and stuff. Is there anything I didn't ask you that I should have?
I think we covered a fair amount. One thing I'll do is I'll just sort of pitch this to the industry, because I think it's really important. But just as an overall, the value of bringing project costs down will massively increase affordability in Toronto. I think people don't necessarily respect that relationship, people understand in the industry, of course, but I think outside the industry, this idea of, especially on the government side, reducing costs, development charges is a huge item that would increase affordability immediately. And the reason why that works is because to get affordability, more broadly speaking, in the city of Toronto, you need to reduce the cost of projects such that you can build profitably in lower rent areas or sell in lower revenue areas. And getting there is a combination of both private sector innovation and legislation at the level of the government to get these costs lower so that the private sector can build in these areas and service the part of the market that has traditionally been unserved.
And to your point, and that's a very valid point, the development charges obviously is a very big ticket when you look at the performance of a project. But there's also, I want to emphasize the hidden costs of the government, which comes through time that it takes.
Yeah.
The site plan process, even the zoning process. And not the very least, even there are some simple steps that I'm sure you have or you will encounter in your project that you go through a utility company and it takes them 3 months or 6 months to respond to one email. And that 3 months of not knowing that single decision probably has cost your project a couple $100,000, and it adds up. It just a lot of those things. That's very true. By speeding up the process, facilitating it, and perhaps decentralizing it a little bit. Like we have a lot of things that are going on that, yes, city needs to be the technical and safety watchdog for our society, making sure that we're building safe buildings, we're building good communities. But at the same time, if you don't have the capacity, if you don't have the bandwidth to process all the applications and developments that are happening in at least GTA area, and you're just hindering it, that's another hidden cost, which unfortunately the end user ends up paying for it or not being able to use the product. So
yeah,
fully agree with what you said. Thank you, Jonathan. I very much appreciate your time. I'm hoping that hopefully in a year or so, when you're in the midst of or toward the end of that project, we can do another one and pick your brain a little bit more.
That'd be awesome. Yeah, we could do it on site. That'd be cooler.
You know what? We'll bring our microphones there and we'll do one on site and we'll see how it goes.
Amazing. Okay. Amazing. Thank you so much for having me. This was a lot of fun.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Just one last thing before you leave. We've created a document called Real Estate Development Toolbox, which you can download for free from our website at realestatedevelopmentinsights.com. This document is basically the result of us asking our network and our listeners, what is the top tool that you use on a daily basis to keep yourself aware of information that's going on in the industry, the changes, the trends, the technologies, the regulations, and or if you with the tools that you use to make sure that you deliver quality results to your clients and customers, the tools that help you with productivity in what you do, and also any softwares, specialized softwares that you think are useful to share with others. So if you think there are resources that you're using on a daily basis and you would like others to know about them, please make sure to let us know, and we will make sure to include it in the next iteration of this toolbox. Thank you very much, and I hope you find this document useful.